I think we are officially live here on Facebook. Welcome everyone to Cocktails and Fishtales, the digital edition during this time. Cocktails and Fishtales, for those of you who may be unfamiliar or haven't had the chance to join us in person, is a science social series that we at Harbor WildWatch put on every month, where we are lucky enough to have a guest presenter with us talking about an interesting and relevant marine topic. My name is Carly Vester. I'm the communications specialist for Harbor WildWatch, and I am so thrilled to be joined this evening by research biologist and founder of Cascadia Research, John. Oh, John, I'm gonna mess up your last name again, and I just learned how to pronounce it. Kamabokidis. Close. He's nodding. I got a thumbs up. Okay. I'm really excited to be joined by John from Cascadia Research. And for those who may not be familiar with Cascadia Research is a nonprofit based out of offices in downtown Olympia, but they also conduct field research in the Canadian Arctic, Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Mexico, and waters off of Central America. They've been conducting research and education for the past 39 years. And tonight, John is going to be talking a little bit about the giants of the Salish Sea, gray whales, humpback whales, blue whales, maybe more. I haven't seen this presentation, so I'm very excited to have him joining us to hear more about this. We welcome questions as we go through the presentation. I will fire those off to John and he'll answer if he can, but we also will have a question and answer at the end of this presentation. We're gonna go until about 7 o'clock, so you're welcome to stick with us through then. Again, asking questions at the end or throughout. But without further ado, I'm gonna pass this over to John. You're up, John, go ahead.
Great, thanks. Nice to talk to all of you, and appreciate being able to do this. I'll be trying to go fairly quickly through some of these slides because I'm going to cover some of the research we do primarily on three species: humpback whales, gray whales, and to a lesser degree, blue whales, and highlighting some of the work we've been doing on those species, especially in the Pacific Northwest and our local waters. And part of what we do is we conduct research in a variety of ways. It's actually our 41st year. We started Cascadia Research in 1979. This is kind of from a poster of the different things we do. We tend to specialize in studying abundance and trends of a number of large whale species, and as well as some of the dolphin species. A lot of work, our work is really centered in two primary areas: the US West Coast, and then a Hawaii research program headed by Robin Baird with Cascadia. In terms of our West Coast research, we respond to strandings, we do surveys in small boats, we deploy tags on whales, and we try to focus on research that can play a valuable role protecting different marine mammal species and aiding in conservation. Here are the three species I mentioned that I'd be talking about today. And a lot of the basic questions and types of research we do with all three of those species are pretty basic stuff in some ways. We're trying to often answer the basic question of how many are there? How's their abundance doing? What's the trend in their numbers? Are they still recovering from commercial whaling? Because all three of these species were heavily hunted through either the early or the modern era of commercial whalings. Document their migrations and movement patterns. And then we kind of have different aspects, especially related to human impacts. We've heavily studied things like the impact of Navy sonar, ship noise, ship strikes, and entanglements. And at the end, I'll be talking a little bit about some of these threats to whales and ways we've tried to look at it. So some of our research is aimed at answering basic biological questions, but also these questions of human impact. One of the exciting parts of my job is that having done this for a long time, studied some of these species now for over 30 years, is that I get to carry forward some aspects of long-term research. And one aspect is the long-term tracking of identified individuals from natural markings. In the case of humpback whales, using markings on the tail fluke. In the case of a gray whale that you see on the slide here, pigmentation patterns on the side of the whale. And we've maintained these long-term photo ID catalogs, records of different individuals for long periods. And on the simple table you see here for humpback whales, for example, we have over 5,000 different individuals that we track with these natural markings just on the US West Coast. And we've documented almost 50,000 encounters with those individuals. On average, each individual is seen about 10 times. And you can see for gray whales and blue whales, not quite as large, but similar large sample sizes. And for all three of those species, we're probably have the largest collaborative catalog of identifications of these whales. And I say collaborative catalog because while we gather some of these identifications ourselves in our own research, we're also heavily dependent on our collaborations and contributors, both with other research groups or naturalists on WhaleWatch operations. For humpback whales, there's an online new program called Happy Whale, started by Ted Cheeseman, that kind of manages the contributions from especially naturalists and researchers, and has developed an online matching system. We collaborate with that. So these identifications can come from a number of different sources. One of the neat things is we get to cover the whole West Coast, and this was most dramatic in 2018. So even though I'm going to focus on the Pacific Northwest, in 2018, for example, we worked with a NOAA ship that you see image there. Is it the survey lines up and down the coast, which you see on the right, and it was doing this very thorough coverage. And we traveled up and down the coast launching our small inflatables, which you see there in the lower left, to obtain the identification photographs, collect skin samples, and sometimes deploy tags, which is what we're preparing to do there. And it allowed us to cover the whole coast, because that shows you Washington to California very thoroughly. And just to get a feeling of what that effort looks like from the small boat, these three maps that you'll see here, this leftmost panel map, you see these faint squiggly lines along it, and that's actually our small boat tracks from the surveys we did launching from shore and going out. You can see they kind of go out from shore, but they covered most of the US West Coast. And this is, again, just for 1 year. In the middle panel, you see where we sighted humpback whales along the coast. So we had success up and down the coast. And then to the right, you see where we collected these skin samples from them. And zooming in a little bit more now to the Pacific Northwest, you'll see our surveys here in Washington, covered both offshore waters, but also heavily covered the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Squares here show the locations we sighted humpback whales inside waters. And blowing that up a little bit more to here, the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And this is kind of an exciting new part. I'll show you a couple of other slides related to this. Is one of the dramatic changes with humpback whales is we used to historically see them primarily just off the Washington coast. But increasingly in the last 10 years, we've had more and more humpback whales coming into the Strait of Juan de Fuca and even to Puget Sound. And especially these ones over here to the right, that are off Victoria, between Victoria and Port Angeles, have increasingly also become the subject of some of the WhaleWatch activities that go out, that started primarily aimed at southern resident killer whales, but now also conduct whale watches to see these humpback whales. But we had several hundred humpback whales here in 2018 here in the Central Sound, in the Central Strait of Juan de Fuca that I'm circling here. So we sometimes get rather large numbers of humpback whales coming into the straits. This has generally been good news, like I'll show you. It's primarily a result of a growing humpback whale population. But as I'll also point out as I show you some of our research results, it's also increasingly brought these humpback whales into areas of higher levels of human activities. This is a major shipping route for all the ships leaving, Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle, Tacoma, all come out the Strait of Juan de Fuca here, right through the shipping lanes, run through the middle, right through this area of concentration of humpback whales in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And also as they've come into more nearshore and coastal waters, it's created more of an overlap with some of the fishing activities, some gill net activities, as well as some of the Dungeness crab uh, fishery activities as well. And I'll show you the result of some of that. Now, up and down the West Coast, we've tried to document the kind of key areas that humpback whales use. When I refer to some of these publications like this one I'm showing here, these are all available through the Cascadia Research website. And this was a paper we did a few years ago identifying what we called biologically important feeding areas for humpback whales up and down the coast. And we did this for, blue whales and for gray whales, showing kind of key areas along the US West Coast, down in the Southern California Bight, the Santa Barbara Channel, Monterey Bay, and the Gulf of the Farallones off San Francisco are key areas, as well as up here off northern Washington as well. Now, humpback whales go through annual migrations, and our studies have been pivotal to looking at where these whales migrate to. This is a figure taken from a summary done by Paul Wade, a researcher in Seattle, taking data from a study Cascadia coordinated called SPLASH that involved over 400 researchers across the North Pacific, contributing photographs and collecting samples of humpback whales from some 14 different countries, ranging from Central America up through Canada, over to Russia, and down through Japan and the Philippines. And we looked at the movement patterns of these humpback whales. And in a summary, I'll just use this figure to show humpback whales tend to breed in winter in these warm water, low latitude areas in the Western Pacific. That's south of Japan and off the Philippines, in Hawaii and the Central Pacific, down here in Mexican waters, and also down through Central America. And then they feed at areas further north, generally extending from California, Mexico border over here in the eastern North Pacific, but all the way around the Pacific, including up into the Bering Sea and Arctic over to Russia, and in these more northern waters. And this particular figure documents some of our estimates of abundance and some of the movements of animals between those feeding and breeding areas. Now, we've been studying this intensely on the West Coast, and I'm not going to belabor too much on this figure, other than to show you as you go, this map of the US West Coast lines up with these figures here to the left, which show the proportion of animals in feeding areas along the US West Coast that go to Central America, Southern Mexico, mainland Mexico, these offshore islands of Mexico and Hawaii. And the main take-home message that I want to make from this figure is that where these animals go to breed varies as you go up and down the coast. Down in Southern California, we see a highest proportion of whales going to Central America. Off Northern California, the highest proportion is going to Mexico. And then as you come further north off Washington and go north from there, animals predominantly go to Hawaii. So you see this shifting distribution of where they go to, and it forms a rather complex pattern. Now, one of the things we've been able to use our Photo-ID to do is document the trends in abundance of these animals. And we've seen a pretty exciting recovery of humpback whales. Humpback whales were hunted in the North Pacific through 1966, so not that long ago. And in fact, even through 1966, there were whaling stations operating in San Francisco Bay, right on the West Coast, hunting whales off the California coast. And that really heavily depleted. It wasn't until international protections kicked in 1966 to ban hunting that we started to see a recovery of humpback whales. From down, in the neighborhood off the US West Coast of a few hundred, and North Pacific wide, maybe only numbering 1,000 or 2,000. Now we've seen those numbers multiply. This shows you the trend for the feeding area off California and Oregon. This is again taken from our Photo-ID data, these tail flukes that you see here, and then employing different what we call mark recapture models to kind of estimate what proportion of the population we've identified and extrapolate it to the whole population. And you'll see from the start of our research in the 1980s, we estimated only about 500 humpback whales off California, Oregon, and now we're up around 4,000 and 5,000 these different lines represent different models we can apply to this data. And you can see there's some uncertainty in some attempts, these different models used to correct for biases. So we've gotten some uncertainty, especially in recent years. But generally, this dashed line with circles shows the trajectory humpback whales have been on, which is about a 7 to 8% annual increase in humpback whales, which is a pretty high rate of increase for a long-lived, slow reproducing animal. So we've seen a pretty rapid recovery. For a while, we thought the population had stabilized. Around 2010, it looked like our estimates had leveled off, but they've increased sharply in recent years, and we now think that apparent leveling off may not have been real. And really, the population looks like it stayed on that trajectory. But that's one of the kind of findings we're trying to resolve right now. If we look at off Washington and southern British Columbia, a different feeding area for humpback whales, we similarly see a pretty dramatic increase in numbers, going from, again, just a few hundred animals in the mid-1990s to now around 1,000 or more animals today. So they're showing, if anything, this is a higher rate of increase than what we saw off California and Oregon. Now, with these increases, we've also seen humpback whales returning and showing up in a number of areas that they hadn't been seen for 40, 50 years, and these arrows show some of those areas. We've seen an expansion of humpback whales into areas of the Southern California Bight and further south. We've seen more humpback whales coming into inside waters like San Francisco Bay and even into the Columbia River. And probably most dramatically, the Salish Sea, the area. Salish Sea encompasses Puget Sound, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Strait of Georgia, kind of inside waters of Washington and British Columbia. We've seen that dramatic increase in animals. And if you look at just our sighting reports of humpback whales into the Salish Sea, you can see we had very few through the 1990s. And then it was, again, right around the late 2000s that we saw a big increase in the sighting reports from the public, indicating this influx of animals into the Salish Sea and inside waters. I mentioned the whaling and that occurred. We even had whaling occurring here in Washington State. There was a whaling station that operated in Grays Harbor on the Washington outer coast. And this is a photograph taken from there that took, many hundreds, and I think it was over 1,000 humpback whales got taken at the whaling station in Grays Harbor called the Bay City Whaling Station. And you can actually still see remnants of this whaling station if you drive out to Westport. There's a bridge you go over just before you get to Westport and make that turn to the north. And you'll see there's a road tellingly called Whalebone Way. And if you look to your left as you cross going to the west, you'll see a bunch of pilings. And those are the pilings right here from that whaling station, the remnants of the whaling station that actually burned down in the 1900s. So that's what I was going to tell you about humpback whales. Before I get to the human impacts, I'm now going to tell you a little bit about gray whales. And I'm going to try to keep moving quickly here because I'll tell you a little more about gray whales. Gray whales are a different baleen whale like humpback whales. They filter feed, but I'll show you they feed a little differently than humpback whales. They primarily migrate in the eastern North Pacific from breeding areas down here off Baja. And then they migrate up the coast to their primary feeding areas up here in the Arctic. And this used to be primarily the northern Bering Sea, but now extends further up into the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas to the north as ice cover has allowed them to travel further north. They make these very long migrations. In fact, humpback whales and gray whales, there's a bit of a battle between the two for who makes the longest migration. And there's been kind of battling publications, which we've been a part of actually, documenting, kind of a new record migration for an individual. At the moment, the longest documented migration sits with humpback whales. But as I said, it's been going back and forth. And these whales primarily migrate along the coast. We see them headed northbound. Typically this time of year, from March through May, is when they're migrating north past Washington State. And they're generally coming back south in December past Washington. Now, our research has also focused in what's shown in green here, an area that we found that about 200 animals that we call the Pacific Coast Feeding Group seem to not make that migration further north. And they stay through the spring, summer, and fall feeding in the Pacific Northwest. And it seems to be the same individuals primarily returning annually to that group and staying and feeding. They feed on a different prey base than the larger population, and they become a particular concern. They're in our waters longer, so they would be more vulnerable and susceptible to things like entanglement or disturbance and other threats like that. I'll also be talking about a group, this little inset right here, in northern Puget Sound, right around Whidbey Island. There's also a group of about a dozen gray whales that we call the Sounders that are, again, the same gray whales returning every year to feed from March through May. But then, unlike the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, those whales then continue their migration up to the Arctic and don't stick around through the summer. So I know I'm giving you a confusing bunch of information. There's a larger gray whale, Eastern North Pacific gray whale population, this group of 200 that what we call the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, or the PCFG, that feeds from spring through fall in the Pacific Northwest. And then we have these Sounders that feed for a few months and then continue north in their migration. Now, I mentioned gray whales are a baleen whale. They filter feed through this coarse baleen. This is the baleen over here on the left hanging from the roof of their mouth, and it forms these dense plates that hang down. But on the inside and the bottom edge of these plates, you actually see these hair-like frills. And this is looking at the baleen here on the right from the inside. We're actually looking through the lower jaw of a dead gray whale, and we're seeing the inside of the baleen. This is kind of the shrimp's eye view of baleen. And you'll see how that baleen and the hairs coming off of it form this dense sieve-like mat that can filter feed. And these whales primarily filter feed from the inside. They bring prey into their mouth, and then they filter feed it, pushing it out, so that what's too large to go through this sieve-like mat gets caught on the inside, and they can then swallow it. So it's kind of a little interesting contrast. I think you'll be hearing more about gray whales. Gray whales were heavily hunted, historically for thousands of years by the Makah tribe, most notably, but some other native tribes hunted whales. But the Makah probably were the greatest specialists in whale hunting. They hunted both gray whales and humpback whales. This photo on the right is actually taken from the early 1900s and one of the last hunts before their hunting was suspended. Gray whales got so depleted that it became not really profitable for whalers or practical for the tribe to keep hunting them. But in the late 1990s, the tribe proposed a resumption of their historical Aboriginal hunt for gray whales. The tribe, through their treaty, the Treaty of Neah Bay in 1865, had actually reserved and had wording in their treaty to retain their rights to whaling. It's the only tribe that has that as a specified treaty right. These photographs on the left are actually from a whale that they took in their initial resumption of that hunt in 1999. Since then, there's been kind of a series of kind of legal challenges and kind of responses to them that have been occurring. A full environmental impact statement prepared, exemptions to the Environmental Policy Act and the Marine Mammal and the and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, steps that have been gone through, that had to be gone through due to some of the legal challenges. We may be seeing the resumption of that hunt in coming years because we're sort of coming to the end of some of those legal challenges. One of the amazing things about gray whales that's a little different than the other baleen whales, we used to think of them as highly specialized feeders because they, in many areas, feed right off the bottom, actually sucking in some of the sediment off the bottom and then filter feeding through that sediment to pull out organisms that live in the sediment. So this photograph here on the left is actually an aerial view of a gray whale its head is here, its tail is here, and this is characteristic. This mud plume would be what you would often see with a feeding gray whale, because it's filtering through that slurry of water and mud and prey. But in the northern Puget Sound around Whidbey Island, those Sounders gray whales actually come into shallow waters, intertidal waters, waters that are totally exposed and high and dry at low tide. And they come in there at high tide when there may be 10 feet or less of water, often not enough water to even fully submerge their bodies. This kind of shows the flukes and peck fins of 2 whales that were feeding in the shallows here. And then when low tide goes out, it actually exposes sometimes these pits. So this is an aerial view of the mudflat at the Snohomish River Delta. And what you see here is these little depressions have trapped water. These are actually depressions about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide that were made by gray whales feeding when there was high tide and enough water for them to get in there. And they've effectively filter fed on some of the ghost shrimp that were in these areas. And I'll show you some of the data from that later. Now, one of the things that's going on with gray whales that has raised some concern is we've seen a pretty dramatic spike in gray whale mortality in Washington state last year. And this is a chart of annual number of strandings of gray whales documented in Washington state. And you'll see typically we're getting something like 4 to 8 gray whales a year. This goes back to 1977. But you'll see here in 1999 and 2000, there was a big 2-year spike. And that was, one of the first ones we documented. It occurred up and down the US West Coast, including into Mexico and up into Canada and Alaskan waters. And hundreds of gray whales were documented dying in this 2-year period. We documented 50 in Washington state in those 2 years. It was declared what was called an unusual mortality event, so it got extra scrutiny. But what I want to draw your attention to is over here to the right, you'll see we actually exceeded that last year. In 2019, we had 34 dead gray whales wash up in Washington state, a record that we had documented in any past year, and even exceeding that 1999-2000 event. We're currently up to 6 in 2020, and I'll show you some data related to our trend there, because we've had an intensified effort trying to document mortality now that we saw that huge spike in 2019. That unusual mortality event in 2019, I mentioned, affected, these are locations of gray whales. This is drawn from the NOAA website that coordinates some of the data on the unusual mortality event and takes data from groups like us in Washington state, but links it in with other groups responding up and down the range of gray whales and in other countries. And you can see the mortality event in 2019 extended pretty widely, all the way up from Mexico and the breeding grounds, all the way up the West Coast and Canada and up into Alaskan waters. And it did involve, over 200 gray whales were documented in 2019 and that died up and down the range. And I will point out that those documented numbers represent likely a small fraction of the true number dying. We know many, and in fact, most gray whales that die do not wash up, especially if they're starving gray whales. They'll sink to the bottom. If it's deep enough water, they'll never come to the surface. So they'll float offshore or create these whale falls on the bottom. And we think the number documented may be, somewhere in the 10 to 20% of the true mortality. So that means you would have to multiply the documented numbers by 5 to 10 times to get the likely true number. So these mortality events are pretty big events, having some serious consequence to the population. Looking at 2019 and our data from Washington state, you can see, I'll just show that it included both the females and males. It included age classes from adult all the way down. The largest group was these juvenile subadult animals. We were able to respond to 26 of the 34 strandings, conduct 18 necropsies where we could conduct an examination to look at cause of death. All of the ones we looked at had some indication of, nutritional stress that the animals were under, with half of them being pretty severe nutritional stress. So we think part of what's going on with gray whales, certainly one element of it, is that a growing gray whale population. The last estimate of the Eastern North Pacific gray whale population was the highest ever at 27,000. It looked like it had made a pretty dramatic recovery from those low whaling numbers. And that had potentially reached, the limits of the food supply or hit a downturn in the food supply. So that was probably one contributing factor. But we're really concerned with other environmental factors that may be at work, and we still can't rule out some disease factors that might be at work that we just haven't been able to detect. We know very dramatic changes have occurred in the Arctic ecosystem with dramatically less ice. Some of those may have benefited gray whales in that it has made their feeding areas accessible earlier and for longer periods and expanded the areas they can get to feed. But the key question is how maybe it's affected the prey density, because we know prey density in some of those feeding areas have declined. So that's some of what we're looking at. This year, our responses have been hampered a little bit by trying to stay coronavirus safe. So we've tried to keep social distancing, do responses with more limited personnel traveling to the site separately. Fortunately, it looks like it's not a big mortality year. We've had the 7 dead gray whales we've had so far. That says 7, it actually should be, okay, it should be 6 through 20 May compared to 20 at this time last year in that larger mortality event. I will also show, this is looking at all of the US data from California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska through April. And this shows the 2020 mortality here in the first bar for each month, the 2019 mortality in the second bar, and then what's normal. And the picture that emerges is, you can only look at this for 2020 through April, but it suggests that our mortality in 2020 is well below what we were seeing in 2019, though it's still above average. Okay, I think I'll just jump over this. I'll jump over this a little bit. I will mention that the Pacific Coast feeding group of gray whales that I said numbered around 200 to 250 has been pretty stable. These are our abundance estimates going back to the late 1990s for that group there. So that's been also holding pretty steady. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about the Sounders gray whales, those gray whales that feed in northern Puget Sound that we've had an opportunity to study intensely. These are these whales that are there from March through May, sometimes into June. There's about a dozen of them. And the amazing thing is some of these whales, like this first whale you see here with this big white patch, which we, gave the very creative name of Patch to. It's our whale 49 in our catalog. We have seen going all the way back to 1991, returning to this area to feed almost every year that we've had effort in there. And among these dozen regular whales, it's remarkable how those same whales travel that 150 miles off their migration to now come feed in this area. And this figure here shows data going back to 1990 on the left, all the way here to 2020. We've updated it through 2020. Each row is a different individual. These are the number we give them. Here are some of the names we've given these whales. They're mostly males, but we have documented at least 3 females. And then if the bar is green, it means we saw it that year. And you'll see that whale Patch that I just showed you is on this row here, if you see my cursor, and you can see it's been seen almost every year coming back to this area to feed. Oh, I didn't mean to go ahead there. Let's go back. What's interesting is that we have never seen any of the even female whales with a calf, but there's one telling thing. Here on the second row, this whale here, 22, or that we've named Earhart, we think this is one of the kind of pioneering females that discovered this feeding strategy in this area to feed, and I think has actually been leading some of the other whales into how to feed in this really challenging environment of feeding in the intertidal zone. And you'll know, even though we've now seen her over 30 years and never seen her with a calf. You can see these gaps in white here every 3 to 4 or 5 years. And we suspect those are years she may have had a calf, and she doesn't bring her calf into northern Puget Sound to feed. Mothers with calves sometimes migrate later, so maybe there's not enough time for that side trip. But also it could be a very wise move in the sense that that would be an extremely risky strategy to take a calf into, since these whales are feeding in intertidal waters that if you don't get the timing perfectly, you'll end up high and dry. And I'll show you some examples of how that can occur. Now, we've wondered, how did these whales discover this area, and especially take the chance to learn to come into the intertidal zone to feed on these dense ghost shrimp beds? And we got an insight into that here. And here on top, you'll see this is the same graph I showed you earlier with number of strandings, except it only goes through 2015. And here in 1999, 2000 is that peak two years of UME. And the other time, the other 2-year period where we had high mortality was 1990 and 91. That's the next high pair of years, other than when we get to 2019. And down here on this lower chart, you see when did new whales join this group of Sounders gray whales? And it occurred in 2 primary periods, 1990 and 91, and 1999 and 2000, coinciding with these high mortality years for gray whales in Washington state. And what we believe this reflects is that in years where these whales were facing nutritional stress and high mortality, that's when we often see whales wandering into new areas in a more desperate search for prey. And we think it was that desperation that likely led to these whales discovering both this area and this highly risky feeding strategy. And when I say highly risky, this is an aerial view of the Snohomish River Delta. The city of Everett is right here. This is the Snohomish River coming out. This is the Delta. Shallow water of the Delta extends out to about here where my cursor is. And then each of these dots is a location we documented a feeding pit of a gray whale in the intertidal zone. And this actually came from Google Earth. If you go to Google Earth, you can bring up a clock icon to be able to scroll back through historical photos where there were springtime photos taken at low tide of northern Puget Sound. If you zoom in on them, and this is a Google Earth image right here, you can actually see these feeding pits. Each of these little dots where my cursor is are feeding pits of gray whales. And close to 20,000 of these feeding pits could be detected through Google Earth in the work that was done by one of our former interns, pouring through those photographs and documenting those locations. So it ended up being a really powerful tool. Now, also this year, we've been trying to study the health of some of these sounder gray whales. And so we've been working with John Durbin and Holly Firmbaugh, who work with SR3 and Southall Environmental Associates. And they conduct some of the drone-based visual health assessments of some of the southern resident killer whales, looking at their body condition. And this year we started an intensive study using that same technique, working with them to look at the body condition of gray whales. And in particular, focusing on these sounder gray whales. And here they are launching their drone to get some of the aerial images. And this has been pretty exciting to us because now this is 2 different individuals. On the left here, you see 4 photographs taken started on 19 March of this year through 4 May. This is all of whale 21 that we call Shackleton. And you can see he arrives pretty thin. You can see his girth is pretty minimal. But within 2 weeks, he's already noticeably fatter. And here by early May, you can see he's got, well, getting kind of a pronounced belly here, if you will, getting pretty girthy. And this actually surprised us in the sense that we knew this feeding strategy had to be paying off for these whales, but we had no idea it would create such a dramatic and short-term improvement in their body condition. Because when Shackleton would have arrived here, he would have not fed for 3 or 4 months. And within 2 weeks, he's already showing some considerable weight gain. Here's another whale. This is Patch that I showed you earlier. And here again, photographs just barely 2 weeks apart. And in many of these regular whales, considerably girthier just within the short time. So we're both excited about using this methodology to look at the health of whales when they got there, but also how well they're gaining from this particular feeding strategy. Now, interestingly enough, we have seen an influx of new whales. I showed you that earlier figure that during those high mortality events of past, we saw new whales joining this group. And we see some indication of that occurring last year and this year. It's still a little early. I didn't include it on the figure yet because we're still evaluating some elements of that. But it has kind of already gotten our attention for that. But it's interesting that in some cases, what we're seeing is we're noting that we're not really spotting that some of these new whales that are unfamiliar with this area are getting as fat as quickly as the ones that are familiar with it. And so this is one particular new whale right here. And you'll see these are photographs taken starting again in that mid-March all the way through early May. And this whale is not gaining any weight. And if anything, might be slightly skinnier here for May. So it may take a little bit of experience for these whales to learn how best to feed and take advantage of this, again, risky feeding strategy that they undertake in that area. Now, we're also measuring the health of whales through photographs of their side. I won't go into this, but this is a technique that's letting us look at this over longer periods of time. We're also collecting skin samples with a biopsy. And usually we only use this technique kind of infrequently, but we're using it this year with the sounders to look at the lipid content and the level of stress hormones that they're facing. We have to do that a little more single-handedly. Here you'll see, I'll show you a quick video of collecting one of these samples. This is the rigid hull inflatable, and in this case, a head cam I'm wearing while I take a biopsy sample because I'm operating solo. And the drone was operating over this whale, and here you'll actually see the dart in the air from this sample being taken right here. But here we are approaching when the whale arches, and that's collecting that sample right there with the crossbow. That dart hits the whale and bounces off, but it's got a little hollow tip, so it collects a little skin sample with that. Now, I mentioned that some of these whales that have been dead, but even some of the whales that we've seen live, not the sounders regular whales, but some of these other whales have been really emaciated. And this was one gray whale from 14 April that actually beached itself on the Snohomish River Delta. And this is a very unnatural body shape and contour. This is looking from the back of the animal to the head. This is the rib cage distended out. And this animal is actually kind of starving. I was able to help make sure it got off of being beached in this case, but there wasn't much we could do. This is a whale unlikely to be able to survive and recover from this severe depletion. So we are seeing some of these whales still struggling this year. Now, because I'm at 5:45, I'm going to maybe skip a few more slides here. I'm going to talk a tiny bit about tag deployments, and I'm going to cover blue whales really quickly. We have deployed primarily suction cup attached tags to whales to document what they're doing underwater and their feeding rates. Early on, we used a larger camera called National Geographic's Critter Cam. More recently, with the sounder gray whales, we used these really small tags developed by Custom Animal Tracking Solutions that had dual video cameras, but gathered a very rich suite of data and were much smaller. They would take video for up to 6 hours, but we could get data for 30, 40, 50 hours as long as the suction cup stayed on. And so they've been kind of very effective in that. And to deploy them, we use this bow pulpit on the front of our inflatable boat. This is one of the very first deployments we did on Earhart, in this case, in 2015. And you can see we're just barely moving, creeping up on these two whales that were resting. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here as we just kind of edge up to them to attach the tag and kind of slap it on the back. So that's attaching the video camera to that whale. And then this is the type of data that we then get. And this was actually from that very first deployment, the deployment I just showed you on the left. Down here is all of this sensor data. There are actually 12 different sensors that are gathering data, sometimes hundreds of times a second, and recording it on the tag. And this is dual video, a camera facing to the left, which is facing kind of almost at a right angle to the left side on the animal. And this is a camera facing right along the body of the whale based on how we deployed it. And we wanted this facing forward so that we could see the whale feeding when it would feed. But on this very first deployment, once we deployed it, this whale, as it swam into shallow water, had one of the trailing whales come up alongside it. And you'll see that happen right here, and ends up bumping this whale. And that's actually turning the camera around 180 degrees. It pressed it on, but now instead of facing perfectly forward, this image is facing perfectly backwards. And you can see now it's facing the animals trailing behind it. So at first we were kind of disappointed at this, but it actually resulted in these cameras staying on a long time. And in this case, if I jump ahead a little bit, you'll see it actually ends up photographing that as this female Earhart moves into shallow water, she actually has 3 different whales, all males, following her into the shallows. You can see how murky the water is here, and they're all shown in this backward facing camera. So it was actually turned out to be kind of interesting to see that. Now, the fact these whales had more physical contact with each other was amazing to see on the tags. Sometimes, like in that last case, it worked against us, but sometimes it worked for us. In fact, this is a deployment that we had, and you can actually see the tag is kind of shaky. It's facing backwards, and you can see it's vibrating. It's hanging on by just one cup. This tag is about to fall off. And here you see 2 whales that are actually rubbing up against this whale. They initially don't make contact with the camera, and this kind of physical contact seems to be pretty common with gray whales. But then in a second pass here, this whale right here hits the tag and remarkably not only presses it back down, the camera is no longer shaking, but has changed the tag to face perfectly forward. So in this case, it benefits. And when the whale shows up, now this is looking just to the left of the animal. On this side, we're seeing the head and looking to the right. So it actually ended up being a long deployment that gave us a really good perspective on the animal feeding and moving. So it was kind of fascinating that way that it worked out. We were able to use the data from these tags to document in red down here, each of these little plateaus that you see represent the whale turning on its right side 90 degrees. And that's where it puts the right side of its head on the bottom and starts to do that suction feeding. So we could actually very precisely use this to document how often each of these feeding pits gets created. And we could track that over to data on how much prey had been removed from each pit. So it ended up being a more detailed record of how often and how much food these whales were taking than has been possible with any other baleen whale that's been studied. So these ended up being really rich sources of data. And I'll show you, when the whale dives, it's doing it in shallow water. It's on the bottom right there, just from where it breathed. Now the head is down on the right. You'll actually see little pits on the bottom on the right here. These are ghost shrimp feeding tubes. And this whale has put its head on the bottom, and now it's going to start suction feeding. It's on its right side, and soon you'll see this kind of plume of mud coming, and that's the whale now starting to filter feed as it kind of processes through the mud. And you actually see a ghost shrimp go by right there that got away from this feeding whale. We ended up finding that the whales were only feeding during these high time periods. So this is 38 hours of data from one of the whales and how deep it was diving. And in these shallow areas here, here, and here, and even here are all periods the whale was feeding in shallow water, diving only about 2 meters deep, so just about 7-8 feet deep. And then superimposed on this is the tide cycle here in that area. And you'll see these feeding bouts are occurring around high tide. Mostly on the rising part of the high tide and only somewhat on the declining part of the high tide. So these whales are kind of knowing when to come on the delta, and they know to get off as the tide starts to fall. And they end up with only these kind of short periods that they can actually feed in that area. And we found similar data on the other tags. That was a consistent finding. We also found that the prey density in these areas, why would they take this risky strategy, was extremely dense, denser than it is in some of the areas of the Bering Sea. So these whales were really taking advantage of high density in these ghost shrimp intertidal beds. Okay, I'm seeing I'm about 10 minutes from when I want it to stop. So I'm going to just move through and show you a couple of quick snippets on other things, and then leave a little time to take some of the questions I see are coming in, and I'll get to those in a second. This is just to show you that sometimes these whales, when they feed, this is an area off the northern Washington coast where gray whales were feeding right in the surf zone. And one of these whales got actually stranded and was stranded for several days. We actually had to launch a rescue effort to try to pull this whale off the beach, which we were successfully able to do. Just because it's really cool, I'm going to show you one more clip of video of a humpback whale feeding. And then I might even jump to just a few closing slides. This is deploying the tag. This is my view down below here from driving the boat. This is in Monterey Bay. This is the view of James, the tagger with the pole. And he's got his eye on a whale that we're right behind right here that we're tracking underwater. We're trying to stay out of this group aggregation of humpback whales, sea lions, and seabirds all feeding on what appeared to be an anchovy school. So here we are hanging back, and now this whale that's right in front of our boat surfaces. He's able to put the tag there on the back. And now we're going to switch views, and you're going to see on the right, you're going to see one view from the tag facing backwards, and on the left you see the view from the tag facing forward. So the head of the whale is over here, the tail of the whale is back here, and these undulations are the whale swimming. That's how it moves its flukes. You'll see other whales coming in view, as well as some of the sea lions and seabirds. And this whale here makes this kind of move and acceleration into this dense ball of anchovies right here in the left. And here he is raising his head, accelerating into this anchovy school and trying to take a lunge on it. You can see he's broken up. Some of the anchovies have split off from that school. Here he actually collides with another whale that's tried to feed on the same anchovy school. And then you'll see these seabirds are picking off some of the anchovies that have gotten broken up by these feeding gray whales. And you'll see the sea lions also coming in primarily behind the whale, taking advantage of the fact that the whales breaks up these schools of anchovy, and they're able to feed more effectively when that school gets broken up. The whales benefit by the anchovies being bunched together. The seabirds and the sea lions benefit by them getting more scattered so they can pick off individual ones. So here as this whale swims, it's going to make another approach on an anchovy school. Here again, you'll see some of the seabirds and sea lions coming into view as it maneuvers towards this anchovy school again. And now here it is, you see some dead anchovies that didn't survive floating by there. And now it's going to first try to approach one school, but this whale is in its path, so it has to go underneath that whale. It actually makes a vocalization right there as it approaches that whale. And then here's another attempt at a school of anchovies, but another whale is already in there making a lunge feed. So this whale has to sort of wait his opportunity. And then here he finally gets it. Now you'll see him accelerate and move into, here's the anchovy school right here that he's going into to make that lunge and ingest a bunch of the anchovies. Okay. So we do the same technique with blue whales. This is approaching a blue whale to tag. I didn't talk much about blue whales, but they kind of roam the whole eastern North Pacific, traveling even, over broader areas to feed that I'm not going to tell you too much about. Their populations seem to be doing okay. We've had some recent sightings off Washington, but none in inside waters. I don't have time, but you can ask me questions. The main types of impacts we're documenting with these whales are ship strikes, entanglements in fishing gear that have increased dramatically in recent years, underwater sound, and some of these changing ocean conditions. Okay, I'm going to go to my final slide here, my conclusions here, since I'm at the end of the hour. Some of the key findings about humpback whales and gray whales and the insights these new tools have provided. And I'm going to turn to your questions now and answer them and read them, but this is a good time to put them in to me as I leave these final slides on. One question I see from Leslie is, what years did the whaling station in Grays Harbor operate? And it was the early 1900s. I believe, I don't have the years in front of me, but I want to say early 1900s into the 1910s, late 1910s, and possibly slightly beyond, but it was in the very first part of the 20th century that whaling station at Bay City operated. Though, as I mentioned, other ones like off of San Francisco operated through the mid-1960s. They operated more recently. I see that a question from Lori, where are they hanging out at low tides? Well, we were seeing several areas. This is when I was talking about gray whales that this question came in. And we would find the whales congregated at some shallow water areas at low tide, often down on the bottom. And at first we thought they were feeding in those areas. But then when we got this video and tag footage back, we realized they were just lying on the bottom, sometimes lying on top of each other or next to each other. And it seemed like they were socializing and resting. And this was only just a few miles from these feeding areas. They didn't go far. And sometimes I wondered if they stayed in a shallow water area so they could maybe better monitor the tide height and know when it was appropriate to move back into those shallow waters. There's also a question from Sally. Do the individuals have handedness? Some tilting to the left, some on the right to feed. And yes, this is actually, we've actually published some articles on this in some of the other species of whales with a number of co-authors. And these tags have revealed that the vast majority of blue whales, humpback whales, and gray whales are all right-handed. They roll on their right side to feed, and that's their predominant strategy, though there are occasional exceptions to that. So there is a handedness to whales that's kind of exciting. Okay, I was going to show you some other sources of information, and feel free to put in any other questions if you have them, and I'll do my best to answer them. Just point out that our website, cascadiaresearch.org, it has links to our YouTube channel where we have some of the video that you've seen, as well as video from some of our other research in Hawaii and other areas. We do post things on our Facebook site in addition to the YouTube channel. If you're a student and you're interested in working with us, we do have internship opportunities. Currently, our interns are having to work remotely with us, but usually they come and work with us. Usually these are college-aged interns working with us for 3-month periods, and there's information on our website for those of you interested in internships and how to work with us. I was just going to point out, general information on whales. The American Cetacean Society online website is great. They have a chapter in Seattle that you can learn more about whales. For some of the work we do, especially related to Navy sonar and impacts of human activities, we work a lot with Natural Resources Defense Council on their international campaigns. That's particularly helpful on the Navy sonar issue. Some of our studies of the impact of Navy sonar on whales were actually funded by and supported by the Navy. But a key part of our research is to make that data available to the public and to environmental groups like NRDC that are also trying to keep the Navy on track with making sure they're meeting all their kind of requirements, as well as NOAA, that's the federal agency responsible for protection and management of whales. There's also like a local whale conservation group, Orca Network, tracks the movements of some of the whales. I'll frequently do postings there, as well as other members of our group and presentations for Orca Network. And it's a place that they share information on whales and sightings. Okay, we've had a few more questions come in that let me answer. Let's see, from Linda, we have great to see the overall increase in whale numbers since '89. From Renee, grateful for the amazing work. Sounds good. So glad our sounders are doing well. Unfortunately, she says she misses them, and one of the things that's occurred in the last 3 months is the sounders had become increasingly the subject of some of the whale watch operations in spring that would come bring people to see the sounders, and those haven't been operating. So there hasn't been as much opportunity for people to see the sounders. There's a comment from Jay that he paddles and sees sounders. Great to learn more about them. Let's see, a question from Leslie. I'm from Virginia, and we have humpbacks. Are they very different from the Pacific humpbacks? And humpbacks do occur in different oceans of the world, including the Atlantic. The Atlantic is a different population. They don't intermix. They can be separated genetically, but they do have a lot of similarities to the humpback whales that we have in the Pacific, but they don't intermix or interbreed. So they have been, genetically and reproductively isolated for some time, but they share some things in common. Some of the Atlantic humpback whales show some amazing innovations in feeding there. There's a group up off New England that has learned to specialize feed on fish species like sand lance, sometimes cooperating together in unique ways. And of course, humpback whales in areas like Southeast Alaska have learned to cooperatively feed and do these cooperative bubble nets to corral fish. So that's kind of an exciting development there. A question from Linda, are we hiring? We do periodically hire. We're not hiring at the moment. In fact, with some of our field work postponed, we're working hard and having to work quite a bit remotely. So we're kind of working to keep our staff busy and occupied. So we're certainly not hiring at the moment. And I will point out that quite a few of the people that work for us started as interns. It was a great way for them to get familiar and trained with our operations and for us to get to know them. So that is one step in that direction. Okay, that sounds great. We're a little after 7 now. Maybe that's a good spot to wrap up unless there are any other questions. I'm just going to hit the stop share right now and stand by a little bit longer and see how we're doing.
Yeah, and I'll pop back in here and encourage folks, if you have questions, we are currently watching the comments of our Facebook page. Please keep them rolling in. John, for folks who are maybe watching this after the live stream and they have questions that are coming up, how can they reach out to Cascadia Research and ask those?
Yes, there are a couple of ways. We do have some of our email addresses on our site, so that is a way to ask questions. Sometimes people ask questions through our Facebook site. I tend to be a little slower catching those sometimes, so you will find my email address on our website to be able to send an email, and that's probably the best way to send it to us and try to have us answer them, especially now that many of us are working remotely and not there to answer phone calls and things like that.
Excellent. And I will say too, I'm seeing a lot of comments coming in saying thank you, but I'm also seeing a lot of John fan club comments. There's a lot of people who are very excited about you presenting John, as well as Cascadia Research's work and everything that you're doing. In particular, when you were showing the video clips of the tagging, there were a lot of comments coming in going, "That's so cool! Wow, that's amazing! I can't believe this." So folks are loving that. We have around 40 to 45 people who are out there tuning in at the moment, which is wonderful to see. I have one question for you while I have you here, John, and while we're kind of allowing a little bit of time with the lag going on to keep those questions rolling in. Could you talk a little bit about how Cascadia Research was founded? I know you're one of the founders, and I'm curious what that story is. And feel free to give a shout out to.
No, I appreciate your asking. It was actually a number of us, primarily who were undergraduate students at Evergreen State College here in Olympia. And we had started doing research on marine mammals as undergraduates. We were able to actually get a National Science Foundation student originated studies grant. And when we graduated in 1978, we looked for how to continue some of the research we had been doing. Initially, some of us, including myself, I worked for a couple of years studying fur seals up on the Pribilof Islands for a federal agency. But very quickly we got interested in could we pull off forming our own nonprofit organization to give us more control over the types of research we would do. We really had this idea of doing real and valuable and bona fide scientific research, but also addressing topics with endangered species, human impacts, things that could help promote and inform conservation and better protection and management of whales. So that was at the heart of trying to have our own entity and seek funding for the studies we thought were important. And that's what motivated us to form it. There were actually about 9 of us that were involved in starting the organization. And it's grown since then. Initially, we might get a contract or grant to do work for a couple of months a year by a few of us. And now we're actually at, I think, 17 regular employees that work with us, a few based in Hawaii, a few based in California, most based here in Washington. And we survive almost solely on contracts and grants from federal agencies. We do get occasional funding from foundations and other nonprofits, but we don't do a particularly good job of soliciting donations. You'll notice I failed to solicit a donation here, but there is an ability to donate through our website. It's a key thing that lets us keep going and do some of this valuable research even when there isn't funding from an agency to fund it. And we're trying to diversify some of our funding base to be able to kind of do broader amounts of work. So look at ways that you can support us that way could really help us out. I'm trying to think anything else. I think that covers the key background on Cascadia.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And super inspiring. We're getting more comments coming in saying great presentation, videos were incredible. This has been inspiring. Our education director, Rachel, said it's so great to see how the tissue samples are collected. You must have practiced with that bow for a while.
Well, let's put it this way. I didn't put in my misses. And there are some. That was what you saw there looked like a really long shot. A little bit of that is the wide angle nature of the thing, so it might have looked more skilled than is normal. But we try to take it from a standoff distance. I did want to show it because I try to be conscious of the fact that some of our activities, even the suction cup attached tags, do disturb the whales. We can only do that research under a federal permit that we have to apply for and show that we have the training and that it meets a real scientific purpose. This is not, you can't approach whales and do this without that kind of a research permit. And I think some of the slides that you saw had reference to the permit on it, but that's a kind of a key point. It's really best, and we've actually seen an interesting reprieve the whales have had in the last 2 months with the absence of boating traffic on the water. These whales have actually had much fewer boats around them, and we try to be conscious of our approaches. We do have some impact by approaching them to collect those samples or to deploy those tags, and we try to keep those at a minimum and only where we feel like we're getting information that will benefit the whales in the long run.
Yeah, and I appreciate you noting that. We have a comment from Brittany that came in. She says, very interesting information. I recently was in touch with Allie with Cascadia Research after sighting 2, maybe 3 grays feeding off Shipwreck Point off the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Can't wait to hear of re-sightings and see if these 2 might one of these days become part of the Sounders.
Yes, well, off Shipwreck Point, those are probably more likely Pacific Coast Feeding Group, the PCFG whales, but Ali Perez is our main highly skilled gray whale matcher, has been doing it for over a decade, can recognize most of these whales on site. So the photographs are in the right hands, and she'll be able to tell you who those are.
And we have another question from Anthony, who asks, feeding strategies have changed. Have the whales started to search for different prey?
Yes, and most dramatically, we've seen some of the changing feeding strategies with humpback whales. And some of that seems to be in response to natural variations in ocean conditions. Humpback whales can feed on either fish or krill, and in different years, we'll see them concentrated more offshore at the shelf edge, feeding on krill, and other years they'll be inshore, like the video I showed you, feeding on anchovy schools. And that can vary by year, and we found it tracks really well with relative abundances of the fish or the krill. When there's little krill and lots of fish, then the whales switch to that. So they do take advantage of that. Obviously, a major concern to us is how is all of this going to be affected by changing ocean conditions? And that's something that's harder to track. We are seeing changes, but currently some of the changes we're seeing seem to be mostly related to kind of natural variations that have occurred over, kind of more cyclical periods, as opposed to some of the longer term trends we've seen in ocean temperature. But obviously those are going to kick in and be an issue. So we're trying to understand better how these changing ocean conditions might be affecting both the type of prey and prey abundance, because that's how the primary way we worry that changing ocean conditions can have a big impact on these populations.
Hmm. And then one more thing from Brittany. She says, update from Ali was that these whales have never been sighted.
Oh, cool. Exciting.
Yeah, very exciting.
And our catalog, I mentioned our catalog is of a few thousand gray whales, and the overall estimate of the North Pacific, Eastern North Pacific gray whale population is 27,000. So we are well short of having identified the entire population and having it in our catalog. So in that sense, while we know most of the PCFG whales, we're still in that migratory period. So you could be getting whales that are still in that larger population migrating by, which could increase the chance that would be a whale not in our catalog. Cool.
Cool. Well, I have one more question that just popped into my head while I have you here, John. I'm curious about collection of the data from the video tags. Is there a time frame that those stay on and then are released, and then you then come and pick them up, I'm guessing? Could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yes, the suction cup attached tags, and I should mention that tagging can look very, very different. There are actually many different tagging techniques and tag types that are used by different research groups depending on the questions being asked and the technology available. So I'm going to answer questions about some of the tags we use, but bear in mind that can vary. And you have some tag types that are what are called satellite tags. They transmit information to a satellite. They don't have to be recovered. That means that sometimes those tags are attached with more implant methods that will stay on for even months or a year or more on a whale. They're obviously more invasive. We don't tend to use those kinds of implant tags ourselves in our own research, but they are used, and they are good for looking at long-term, larger scale movements, but they're really limited in how much data they can transmit to the satellite, because it's only in that brief period. Our tags can record much, much more data, but because we're attaching them with suction cups and we have to recover them, we're only getting that data for very short periods of time. The benefit to the whales is it's less invasive. We do currently not use a release system on most of our suction cup tags because we actually want them to stay on as long as possible. Though once we deploy a tag on a whale, there's sort of this anxious waiting game, because if the whale leaves the area or travels offshore, you could lose your tag. And some of the tags we deploy, I think our most expensive configuration is worth about $30,000 for the tag. So you really want to get that tag back, and you really need it to get the data back. And the longer it stays on, the better the data is, but the longer that stays on, the greater the risk that you might lose the tag. So you always have this sort of trade-off. And there have been some with blue whales in particular, we've deployed some of these tags with short darts that will stay on for 3 weeks at a time. And some of those whales have traveled 1,000 miles or more away, and we've had to launch major expeditions to recover the tag. And there are all sorts of funny stories. The suction cup tags, I think I've been involved in deployments of over 500 of those on, almost a dozen different species, in different parts of the world. So we've done a lot of work with that. And there are some pretty crazy stories that have happened to me in how to recover tags. We had one tag that came off a whale. It was a suction cup attached tag. We documented it was floating. This was actually down in Santa Monica Bay. When we went to recover it, we couldn't find it. And we kept searching, and finally we started to get the signal, but the signal was coming from inland on land. And I finally ended up flying in a plane trying to zero in on it, and it looked like it was coming from this area near Culver City. And I ended up, breaking off from my expedition and traveling in my truck, and I had my bike in back, trying to zero in on this tag on land. And I was having trouble driving and using this directional antenna. And as I got closer, it seemed like the tag would move. So I ended up getting on my bike, and then I could kind of more easily wave the thing around. And I ended up chasing this tag around. I ended up zeroing in on it in a parked car in a Home Depot parking lot, and then waiting for the people to come out. And it turned out to be a tag that this person had picked up in Santa Monica Bay, put in the back of their car, and had been driving around with it. So that's why it kept moving around. And so it actually had a whole bicycle chase where I was trying to track it down. And the story also ended a little bizarrely that I did my transition where I jumped out of the truck and hopped on my bike rather quickly. So even though it took me a half hour to zero in and recover the tag, I then had actually no idea where I had left my car. And it took me several hours riding my bike around to find my truck again. But anyway, there are strange stories like that happen. So.
Oh my gosh. Did you find out why they had picked it up and stuck it in their car? Were they hoping to return it to you? Did they want it for themselves? Like, what was the story there?
I didn't ask a lot of questions because it was a little bit of a tenuous negotiation. It involved a reward in cash that I was paying them.
Oh my gosh.
Once the transaction was happening, I just wanted to get the tag and, but there were some questions I would have liked to have asked that I didn't get a chance to ask.
Well, I'm glad you got it back in the end. Jeez.
There are other kind of stories like that I could go on that are pretty funny. And especially one of my colleagues, James Fallbush, he's done some of the long range expeditions. We had some of our blue whale tags, have the animals go way offshore. We've sometimes traveled, I think the longest I've traveled was almost 250 nautical miles in our small boat to go offshore and recover a tag and have to do it overnight, operating the small boat through the night to get to it. So I know the money sounds like the main motivation, but really the biggest motivator is I feel like once you've deployed a tag, you've kind of disturbed that whale, and you've disturbed it with the justification that you're getting important data to the whale. And so to me, there's both the value of the data and the responsibility of the fact that you want to get that data back and make sure it does serve a useful and important purpose.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. And I love the perspective on that too. We're going to wrap up with one final question that just came through from Sally again. She says, I'm an invertebrate geek and first came into contact with details of gray whale diet by way of interest in crustaceans. So I've seen about all of these tiny, there's some fancy words she's using, crustaceans, amphipods, isopods in their diet. Ghost shrimp seem huge relatively. Is that an issue, benefit for the whales adapting to that diet? Are larger arthropods a typical part of their diet?
Yes, that's a great question, very sophisticated question, obviously. And it is kind of fascinating because the ghost shrimp that these gray whales feed on are, she's correct, are pretty large. They're much larger than the typical prey gray whales are feeding on up in the Bering Sea and the Arctic areas, where they feed on these much smaller, bottom dwelling amphipods, ampellicid amphipods that they feed on. And they also have the ghost shrimp that they feed on uh, have a longer life cycle, 3, 4, 5 years, so they don't regrow as quickly. And so we wondered if that's part of the reason that the gray whales only feed here for 2 or 3 months, the sounders, and then move on. It could be that they deplete that a little bit and it takes a while for that to replenish. Up in the Arctic with these smaller, shorter lifespan amphipods, it's thought that those animals grow pretty rapidly and that the gray whales may actually be playing a positive role by circulating the sediment and disturbing it and mixing it. It may be almost like tilling the bottom, if you will, and in some ways promoting growth of some of these shorter lifespan amphipods. It was some speculation and there was some evidence of that early on. It's be a fascinating question to explore further, and especially to explore with the sounders gray whales. We have this incredible data on the sounders gray whales going back decades, and now with tag data and an ability to sample some of the areas they feed. So we're actually looking for, an invertebrate biologist or maybe someone like Sally that would like to get involved. It would make a great PhD project for students to look at some of the feeding dynamics of our sounder gray whales and how that interacts with the prey base. So it's a fascinating area for more research.
Oh, interesting. Okay, we have one more question slip in if you have time, John. This is from Duran. He says, "Hi, John. Thank you for doing this event. My apologies if this has been asked already, but was the entangled gray last month tagged? And if so, do you have an update on it? Also, thank you for always helping us at Como 4."
Oh, great. Oh, that's great. He's referring to about 2 weeks ago, we had a gray whale entangled in Dungeness crabpot gear off Port Angeles. We are part of a network of responders that respond to entangled gray whales. And in fact, we're fortunate here at Cascadia to have several, myself and one other person are what are called level 4 entanglement responders, so we can lead a disentanglement effort on a gray whale. And that's also a major focus of SR3, another group that we collaborate with. And so we were able to, 2 weeks ago, go out with the help of the fact that Washington Department of Natural Resources and Fish and Wildlife Service had spotted this gray whale and had agreed to stay with it. We were able to mobilize. It was actually a day I was supposed to conduct a survey with the sounders gray whales and was en route. I was able to get up there and find the whale thanks to their help. And then working with Kirsten Flynn, another one of our responders here at Cascadia, it turned out to be a way we could disentangle the whale. And I know I'll probably make someone unhappy saying this, but normally we actually, it's not the best to have a helicopter circling us while we try to do these disentanglements, because that contributes to noise. But this was one of the rare cases where it actually worked out in our benefit, because the helicopter was staying, I think it was a shared Como and King 5 helicopter. It was live streaming the video from the air. And so there were only 2 of us in the boat and a third skilled disentangler, Doug Sandilands with the SR3, was able to be viewing the streaming video at the same time. And I had him on speakerphone, and it was almost like a virtual third person in the boat. And he could even be help directing us from what he could see from the aerial view with what we could see from the water. So it actually ended up being this fascinating interplay of what we could do on the water with limited personnel in the boat, but then making use of this live stream and a skilled person watching and connected with them by cell phone. So we were able to figure out that we could make this, we first attached a telemetry buoy so we could make sure to track this whale. but that telemetry buoy was to track it while it was entangled. Then we moved in and we could see there, the line went through the whale's mouth and then came over the whale's back, came together in a bridle over the pec fin, and then went down to a crab pot hanging below the whale that was limiting its movement. And then it had some buoys trailing behind it. We were able to realize that if we could make a cut of that line coming out of the mouth where it came over the back, it would potentially release the crab pot that was hanging from the whale, and then we could maybe unthread the rest of the line by pulling on the buoy line. And so we were able to make that cut. It dropped away the crab gear. Then we were able to secure the other line and gently pull on it, and it actually unthreaded through the whale's baleen. And we were able to completely free the whale before it got more seriously entangled. So it was a very successful disentanglement effort. And if I'd actually thought about it, I would have actually had some examples of video and photographs from that, but I forgot to put those into that presentation. But I'll make a couple of points. These entanglements, it's only it's a minority of them that get reported or documented. Some that occur offshore don't get documented. It's only when we have boats that stand by and we have ideal weather conditions and they get reported, do we even get a chance to do a disentanglement. And so it's only a small proportion that we can do a successful disentanglement like we did 2 weeks ago. So even though that was really successful, it's not really a solution to the entanglement problem, but it is a way we can at least, save a few of these whales. And certainly death through entanglement is a slow, agonizing, long-term death. Often if any of the appendages become constricted, it slows the whale's movements. They either starve to death or those wrapping lines will slowly cut into the whale's tissues, sometimes even severing a fluke or a pec fin from that. So there's also kind of a humane aspect why we try to disentangle those whales.
Yeah. Wow. Lessons to be learned. And it sounds like teamwork in that case. And I'm glad to hear that it went well. Wow. Well, I think that about wraps it. I don't see any other questions coming in, and I know we're about a half an hour over now, so I want to respect your time, John. Thank you so much, John, for joining us. For folks who want to learn more about Cascadia Research Collective, again, their website is cascadiaresearch.org. I'll leave the link in the comments, and they are also tagged. Their Facebook page is also tagged on our post as well, so you can click over there and follow them and their research. If you want to learn more about Harbor WildWatch, our website is harborwildwatch.org as well. Feel free to pop over there. Otherwise, we are signing off here. Thank you so much for everyone who tuned in, asked questions, engaged. There's a lot of people, again, who are thanking you, John, for joining us and sharing this fascinating and interesting and very relevant research. There's a lot of folks who really appreciated it out there, and speaking from on behalf of the whole Harbor WildWatch team, we do as well.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Perfect. We're going to sign off. Thank you again, everyone.